So when I was in medical school, I worked on a project exhuming mass graves in Bosnia. The first day I showed up in the office in Tuzla, I had very little idea what I was doing or how I could contribute anything of value to this project. We had two objectives together, and one was to help families who had loved ones missing from the war come to some kind of closure. Our second objective was to look for evidence of war crimes and atrocities, including genocide. So I was walking around the office really unsure of what I was going to do in this mix. And I happened upon this stack of papers. It was a very thick stack in a folder, so I started taking a look. And it turned out what was in this folder were autopsy reports, hundreds of them, one after another after another. So I decided to take a look. And as I was looking through this, I just felt this overwhelming need to take what I was seeing and have it contribute to the story that we needed to tell in this work. Right, so this was in 1997, and at that time, there was still active propaganda being produced in the Balkans area saying that, in fact, there had been no war crimes, there were no atrocities, that the mass graves being dug up that we were looking at were simply media hoaxes. And in light of this, I was just sitting there looking at these autopsy reports filled with one fact after another after another. And it was very clear that this was just the evidence that we needed. There's no way this was fabricated. Right? But then the question then became, how do you tell that story? Because this is a very large-scale story, because it's not simply about one death, unfortunately. It always should be, but that's not how history works necessarily. That's not how it worked here. So I had to figure out, how do I tell the story of this larger pattern of meaning? And so I started to count, because that was the only way I could figure out how to do it. And when I started counting, it was funny, Bosnia was the first time I ever worked with real-world data. And initially I thought, well, this is great. I just have to do my job. I have to sort of combine what I know from medicine, epidemiology, pathology, interpret the data, put it together, aggregate it together, and the facts are just so overwhelming that these data will simply speak for themselves. And I quickly learned that was wrong, right? Because our goal in this project wasn't to do great mathematics, it was to change the world in our own way, in the way that we could. And to do that meant more than doing math, it meant taking what we'd learned, taking these results and connecting them to families, to human rights activists, to healthcare professionals who work locally, to prosecutors of war crimes. And that was the really hard part. And looking back at this whole experience, I do feel proud of what I did and what I'd been able to accomplish, my small part in a much larger endeavor. But looking back at it, I also think even now, I wish I'd done that latter piece better, and I could have, but I just didn't know at that time. I was never anticipating the interface of medicine, data, and technology becoming the focus of my career, but after Bosnia, I started thinking about it more and more. And I could see that information was increasingly surrounding us and was going to become a bigger and bigger part of our lives in many sectors of society, including how we think about health, how we think about illness, and ultimately how we think about and experience death. And I wanted to be part of shaping that change. So I made this the focus of my training, which went on for quite some time. I talked to my parents about that. And then I wound up working in the research division at IBM, where I was a part of a wonderful team that was building a technology called Watson. It was one of the most sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that's ever been created. And again, I was happy to be part of this wonderful team that was doing this work. I also felt the need to do something that was going to circle back and connect with patients, with families, with physicians, with nurses. So I left and started my own project, and again, much of this was based on sort of my own experience in Bosnia, where I really found it was not just the data, but how you connect data to people that produced value. And over the last several years, we really have had this kind of explosion in data in healthcare because, historically, most of patient chart records were kept in these kind of antiquated paper charts, and that's finally changed. So we do now have digital data that's clinically rich and meaningful for the first time, that describes health and illness and ultimately what it means to pass away. So this is really going to change, I think, in many ways, our kind of understanding of all these different areas. And I think what's interesting now is that we're kind of at a crossroad, right? And we have a choice to make on what direction we go in and how do we use this data to create value. And I think we really do have kind of two choices. I remember not so long ago I was speaking with a computer scientist who had in the past done work on voice recognition and very complex mathematics associated with that. So I just asked him, like, well, what are you working on now? And he told me, well, as chance has it, I'm actually working in healthcare. I said, oh, that's interesting. I do that as well, as you know. So tell me a little bit more about your work. And what he said was, well, what we're working on now is we're analyzing a lot of data, and then we're telling patients and physicians what the best treatments are for their conditions. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because that baffles me as a physician often, and I kind of know some of the work on data that's been done in this area. Tell me more about it. In particular, one of the challenges I found is how do you communicate why to both patients and physicians? Right? So you have an algorithm that produces a result. How do you communicate that? Because that's a lot of the challenge that I found, is a lot of the hard part of this kind of work. And what he told me was quite instructive. He said, we don't think users, patients, physicians, nurses, are really going to have a lot of interest in the details. So we're building black box algorithms. That was their solution to this problem. And that was particularly interesting because black box algorithms, this is a term that's used not infrequently in technology. They kind of came to notoriety during the financial crisis. So they had a little bit of a hard time during that stretch. It was a little bit of a rocky PR moment for black box algorithms, but they got over that. It's just kind of a funny thing, because more and more these kinds of approaches really are surrounding us and becoming part of the fabric of our lives. So for instance, when we go online and we get recommendations on what to buy or what movies to watch and what music to get, how to get from Providence to Boston in rush hour. It's these kinds of approaches that we're relying on. And there is clear value to that, right? The world is inordinately complicated. We're all very busy. We don't need to know the details of everything, I suppose. So we see these black box algorithms, actually, we don't even see them, actually. They kind of just float in the ether around us, and we often don't have a great sense of this, but they really guide a great deal of our life. So that's one direction. It's kind of interesting when I was thinking about this, because one of the things these kind of approaches do is that they're really good at creating efficiency. Right? They're really good at taking a process and making it better. You can automate more and more of it. But the question that I had, particularly speaking with him, and I was kind of struck by, was, is this really the change that we need in healthcare? Right? I've dedicated my whole life to this area. And when I think about how deep the level of change that's required to fix this is the best use of the data that we finally have producing algorithms that are going to contribute to process efficiency of our current models? Because here's the thing that I think kind of got lost in the shuffle of all this technical mathematical work from this other team. Medicine already runs on a black box, right? It runs on the black box of the physician's mind. So replacing one black box with another, that's great technically. That might be really sophisticated mathematical work and technology work. I'm sure the algorithms, actually I know, they're really quite impressive. But that doesn't change the world. And that's the question I think we have to answer. Do we want better mathematics? Do we want better technology? Or do we want to figure out how to change the world? Right? And there's another pathway, though. And this is a messy, sticky, difficult pathway. And this is the pathway I'm kind of following and trudging on now. But it's really trying to understand how do machines and people, how can they coexist? Right? So how do we not just build an algorithm, but think about how do we incorporate an algorithm with human judgment? And then how do we incorporate the user into that? So when you build the black box algorithm, you think this is going to change healthcare. Part of what you're saying is that the user doesn't really have space in the future, that the patient's voice isn't necessarily going to be incorporated into what we do, because within a black box, there's not a lot of room. It's quite dark. Right? But there's this other pathway. We set up these kind of iterative circles between using data, facilitating judgment, asking deeper questions, and then moving forward. It's a very different model, because when you think about these black box algorithms, really what they're doing is it's a manufacturing model of knowledge. You have data, it's input into the algorithm, and then it outputs an answer. And because the answer is so pristine, it's so crystal clear, the assumption is people should just consume it. It should just make sense. look how great the mathematics are. And again, this does influence our lives. This is going to have a great influence over how we think about illness, wellness, health, all of these issues. That's going to happen. But the question we have to ask is this enough? Because when I think about what I want to do or how I want to see the future change for healthcare, I really am just left cold by that. Is that it? Given the wonders of the data and technology around us, is that really the best we can do? Let me give you an example of this alternative. So the way we work in medicine right now is we generally take patients and we identify or prioritize one particular condition. Right? So we have patients with diabetes, with high blood pressure, with asthma. Right? So we've kind of fragmented patients into these different silos, and they're generally described by one data point. Right? Initially, it's diabetes, asthma, hypertension, which is high blood pressure. And then to magnify that even more, what we've done is we've set up all of our service delivery models in response to this. Right? So we have cardiology, we have pulmonology, we have cancer doctors, and they're all separated. And maybe 40 or 50 years ago, that might have made sense because generally people had one particular condition at a time, and that's what influenced their lives. But that's not really the case anymore. More and more, we see people who have many diseases, and they have them for a long period of time. Right? So they have high blood pressure they might get in their 50s, and they might have it for 20 or 30 or 40 years. And along the way, they get diabetes, and they also get cancer. And while we've fragmented this data, this one piece of data describing patients into these pieces, these silos, that's not how patients experience the world. Right? You don't put on your hat and say, now I'm a diabetes patient, now I'm a COPD patient, now I'm a hypertension patient. And a lot of this kind of reminds me of the way businesses in general often, we talk about, I think, siloing of organizations internally. We often don't think about how have we siloed and fragmented customers, our users, because we make them go through an experience that's reflected in the architectures of our own organizations. And I think a lot about why do we do that, and what can we do in terms of using data to change that. So let me give you an example of just something we're working on now. So in one of the communities we're working on, or working with rather, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is a major issue. So this is a disease that's commonly referred to as COPD, and this is an issue where patients have difficulty breathing. This is often due to many years of smoking. So in general, when we think about these things in medicine, okay, the problem is patients have trouble breathing. They get problems with infections in their upper airways. They get pneumonias in their lungs. Okay, the problem is the lungs. Let's focus on that, and let's fix that. But when you look at large quantities of data in this area, one of the really interesting things you find is that patients with COPD don't just have COPD. In fact, many of them also have anxiety and depression. And this is a really big problem for our current system because one of the biggest silos we have, one of the biggest concrete walls we've created is between physical health and mental health. And we artificially treat them as if they are different. But that's not the experience of life. And this is kind of funny because even as a physician, when you see patients, you know this. It's just really hard to work within these manufacturing models where data goes in, an answer comes out, and that's supposed to define what you do and the kind of services you can deliver. Right, so what's the alternative to this? Well, as we're taking a look at this data set, it stands to reason, again, we know this just from anecdotal clinical knowledge, that if you can't breathe, it creates a lot of anxiety. That's not easy, feeling like as if you were drowning. And that's at times how people feel. So of course they're going to feel anxious. So what sense does it make to divide these services? Why should we think about the world in this way? And then as we were looking at this data even more, one of the things we found is it's not just COPD and anxiety or depression, it's also where they live. And this was really quite interesting because we couldn't exactly explain this. And this meant that we had to change modes of analysis. Data was no longer something that we were going to look at and delve into and understand, but it needed to become a platform for asking better questions. And this is very different than this manufacturing model of data in, processing occurring in a black box, and answer output. Right? This is looking at data and thinking that the higher value of it is to ask better questions. And that's what we did. And we did something quite radical with our the practice that we were working on this is that we actually started talking to people about trying to understand why this was going on. So we talked to patients, and we're continuing to do that. We're talking to the people in the physicians' offices, but not the physicians. We're actually trying to first talk to the people who have the most interactions with the patients, which are often the front office people or the care coordinators who work with them on a routine basis. And one of the things we're finding is that for one group of patients, the reason why they're getting so anxious is because they feel that when the doctor's office closes, they're cut off from help. Right? They can't get the kind of help they need. So if they do get breathless in the evening, they don't know what to do, and they feel increasing levels of anxiety and panic, and they feel that they then need to go to the emergency room. And in turn, they wind up getting hospitalized all the time. And this is one of the main reasons why healthcare is so complicated and inefficient, ironically, because these kinds of things happen all the time. So for one patient, one of the things we figured out we needed to do out of this work was to actually buy him a cell phone, because that was the best form of therapy. Right? Because as long as he felt he was connected and had a number to call, he felt much better about his state of health and illness. Now, the therapy here isn't just the technology, it's not just the cell phone, and it's not just therapy for anxiety, and it's not just treating his lungs better. It's all three of these things combined. But here's the hard part about that. How do you build a service delivery mechanism around that? And even harder, how do you build a financial structure and a business model around that? Right? That's so different than the siloed point of view of lungs, fix them, optimize that. It's so different than how we've used data up to this point where we describe patients by this one data point, and that informs our mental models. Right? How do we do that? How do we get the help from other people in other fields to do that? I'll give you another example of work we've started. So we've been looking at this in another community at patients with hip fractures. Again, hip fractures are life-changing events for people. And unfortunately, we often make light of this because it tends to happen in the elderly. But they really do fundamentally change people's lives, generally in very difficult ways. Mobility goes down, there's a great deal of pain, all of these things. And in general, in medicine, when we think about hip fracture, the one data point we tend to think about is bone density, which means how thick is your bone. Right? So we focus on treating that issue. Many of the treatments are actually quite expensive, but they're necessary. So we really put our heads down and focus on optimizing that silo. But when you look at data, and this is early work that we're doing, but one of the really interesting things that we're learning from users is that it's not just bone density that might matter. It might also matter about the type of housing that they live in. Right? And this becomes really interesting because how do you wrap your mind around that in an office, in a physician practice? It's pretty tough. Because if the built environment is what matters for hip fracture, then what do we do? Right? Because then we have to really start rethinking what care means. Because at that point in time, it's architects who might become caregivers. They might be the people we need. Or even more, it's not just the pharmacist who's dispensing a medication who the patient needs, but it might be a carpenter. Right? So how do we think about that? How do we organize that service? How do we build a business model which will make that sustainable? And when I think about data and the value it can create, these are the kind of things that I think about and struggle with, the kind of things I really need help with, because we can't answer all of these things all at once. But I think if we don't start thinking about the data this way, we won't even start asking these questions. One of the things I've been thinking about over the past 2 days, this has been just a tremendous experience. It's my first time at BIF. But one of the themes that I've seen come up in many of the discussions, and maybe for me, like the main learning point in a way, but one of the things that's come up is this notion that people, individuals encountering in their lives a moment where they have this intuition or this thought. This isn't the story I was meant to tell. Right? This is not the story I was meant to tell. And then an inflection point comes where you have to make a choice. And one of the things that's happening in our lives and will continue to happen is very much going to happen in our perception of health, illness, what it means to be human, quite honestly, to experience pain, is that there's going to be algorithms which are going to tell a story about our lives. And in turn, we're going to have to think about, is that the story that we want to tell? Or better yet, how do we use data to tell the story that we do feel is relevant? that does get across the context of our life, that doesn't reduce us to one data point, where it's not the ins and outs of our lives follow this production model from a factory. And how do we do that? What kind of coalitions do we need to build to do that? Because it's too much for any one person to do it. Right? So I'll leave you with this. When I think about what is the value of data, how is it going to change healthcare? To me, what I've kind of come to realize, and this kind of loops back to my experience in Bosnia, that the value of data, we shouldn't see it in its highest value as an asset that should be mined. It's not a resource or a material or a raw material that we input into this kind of factory. At its highest value, the data is a mechanism of communication through which we can build communities of action to change the world. And these communities of actions will require mathematics. The data is important, but it's not just the mathematics that will ever matter, because it's the combination of mathematics and imagination which will change the world. And I can tell you, we know how to do the mathematics. We have good models for that, but it's the imagination where we're always going to need help. And with that, I thank you.